There are houses that hold their silence differently from other houses. Not the silence of emptiness, which is simply the absence of sound, but the silence of accumulation. Rooms that have absorbed decades of thought and conversation and grief and music and have become, in their quiet, something almost animate. Thornmere Hall was such a house. It stood in the Wiltshire countryside at the edge of an ancient wood, its pale limestone facade catching the last of the October light in a way that made it appear, at certain hours of the evening, as though it were lit from within by something the candles had nothing to do with. The locals called it the Duke's house, as though it were the only one that mattered, and in the particular geography of that county, it was. On the night that changed everything, however, Thornmere Hall was not silent. The East Wing drawing rooms had been thrown open for the first time in 3 seasons, and through their tall Georgian windows, the light spilled out across the gravel drive in warm, shifting rectangles. The voices of 40 guests mingled with the sound of a string quartet and the soft percussion of crystal upon silver, rising into the October air and dissolving there, lost immediately to the indifferent dark of the surrounding park. The Duke of Thornmere was not among them. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Edmund Ravenscroft, the 6th Duke of Thornmere. Anno had excused himself from his own gathering at 9:15 with a murmured word to his secretary about correspondence requiring attention, which was the kind of excuse that everyone present understood to be no excuse at all, and which no one was in a position to challenge. He had moved through the servants' corridor with the practiced ease of a man who had spent his entire life finding the quieter routes through his own home. And he had arrived, as he always arrived, when the weight of other people's expectations became temporarily unbearable, at the library. The library at Thornmere was not a room that made concessions. It occupied the full length of the house's north wing, 3 floors of shelving rising to a painted ceiling. His great-grandfather had commissioned, in a moment of extraordinary optimism, the shelves densely populated with volumes that had been accumulating since the first Duke's time, and had continued to accumulate with each succeeding generation, regardless of whether that generation had the capacity or the inclination to read them. Edmund had the capacity. He had spent the better part of 33 years reading his way through his inheritance with the focused determination of a man who understood that the books were the best of what his family had produced, and that this said something both flattering and sobering about his family. He opened the library door and stopped. There was someone already inside. She was sitting in the corner chair nearest the fireplace. His chair, the one he had occupied since childhood, positioned at the precise angle that caught both the fire's warmth and the best light from the window, and she was so thoroughly absorbed in whatever she was reading that she had not heard the door. The fire had burned down considerably from its evening state, suggesting she had been there for some time. She had not lit the additional candles on the side table. She was reading by the remaining firelight, the book held rather closer to her face than was entirely advisable, her dark head bent over it, with the concentrated intensity of someone who has temporarily ceased to exist as a social entity, and has become instead simply a pair of eyes and a mind. She was wearing gray wool, a companion's dress, one of the invisible ones, Edmund registered, because the social world at gatherings such as his had a precise taxonomy of visibility, and companions occupied its lowest tier. He could see the book's title from where he stood in the doorway. It was not a book he would have expected a companion to be reading. He was about to speak, to announce himself with the simple courtesy of alerting her to his presence, when she turned a page and made a sound. Not a loud sound. A brief, entirely involuntary murmur of disagreement, the sound a person makes when an author has said something they find unconvincing. When the argument has taken a turn they cannot follow without resistance. She was not aware she had made it. Her expression did not change. She simply turned the page and read on. Edmund Ravenscroft leaned his shoulder against the doorframe and found, to his considerable surprise, that he was in no particular hurry to announce himself at all. He had a pencil, he noticed. It was tucked behind her left ear, with the casual precision of someone who kept it there habitually, the way a woman might keep a hairpin. And as he watched, she reached up, withdrew the pencil with a movement so practiced it required no conscious thought, and made a small annotation in the margin of his book. He had owned every volume in this library since birth. He had been writing in their margins himself since the age of 12. He had never once been comfortable with the idea of anyone else doing the same, which made his current response, that small, specific warmth of recognition, the feeling of meeting something familiar in an unexpected form, somewhat difficult to account for. She reached the end of the page, looked up to turn it, and saw him. The expression that crossed her face in the next half-second was a complete and entirely honest record of her internal experience in that moment, and it was composed of, in rapid succession, startlement, mortification, the particular horror of a person who has been caught in an entirely private state of being by someone who had no business witnessing it, and then, beneath all of that, moving faster than the others, a flash of pure, dignified composure, the expression of a woman who had learned to recover quickly from the unexpected, because the unexpected had offered her sufficient practice. She rose immediately, the book still in her hand, and said in a voice that was commendably steady, "Your Grace, I owe you a profound apology. Now, I had understood the library to be available to guests, and I had no idea. I should have inquired properly before." "Sit down," he said. It came out more gently than he'd intended, which was itself something of a surprise. "Please," he added, which was not a word he deployed as frequently as he should. She did not sit. She stood holding the book with both hands, her expression composed and direct, waiting for whatever came next, with the manner of someone who has learned to stand quietly in doorways and take whatever is offered without flinching. It was a quality he recognized and found, in this particular context, quietly infuriating. "You were disagreeing with him," he said. She blinked. "I beg your pardon? When I came in, you made a sound, the kind one makes when an argument fails to persuade." He moved into the room, because standing in the doorway for this conversation felt suddenly inadequate. "What was it that failed to persuade you?" She looked at him for a moment with the expression of a person recalibrating their expectations of a situation. Then she looked down at the book in her hands, as though checking that it was still the book she remembered, and said, "He argues that the examined life requires the suppression of instinct in favor of reason. That instinct is the enemy of genuine reflection." A pause. "I find that unconvincing." "Why?" "Because instinct is frequently what tells you which things are worth examining in the first place." She said it without particular emphasis, the way one says something that seems self-evident, and then appeared to recollect herself and added, more carefully, "I apologize. But I've taken a liberty with your books that I had no right to, and I'm imposing on your evening. I will return it immediately." She held out the volume. He did not take it. "What did you write in the margin?" She held his gaze for a moment. There was a quality to her directness, not boldness, not the performed confidence of a woman calculating her effect, but simply the unadorned directness of a person who has decided that honesty, even when it costs something, is preferable to its alternatives. "Instinct precedes examination as the eye precedes the lens," she said. "It's rather obvious, I know. I should not have written in your book." Edmund looked at her. He looked at her the way he had not looked at anyone in what felt like a very long time. Not the assessing glance of a host calculating his social obligations, though not the practiced attentiveness of a man fulfilling the requirements of a conversation, but with the specific, arrested quality of someone who has encountered something unexpected in a place they had not thought to look for it. "Sit down," he said again, and this time it was less a command than something else entirely. "Please." She sat. "Now let us go back, as is often necessary when a story begins in the middle of things, and understand precisely how Miss Clara Ashbourne came to be sitting in the Duke of Thornmere's library at 9:30 on a Friday evening in October, writing in his margins with the quiet confidence of a woman who had been putting her thoughts onto paper in private for most of her adult life. Clara was the daughter of Professor Gerald Ashbourne, late of Oxford, and latterly of a modest house in Berkshire, who had been in his lifetime one of the country's more distinguished scholars of moral philosophy, and who had died 18 months prior, leaving his daughter 300 books, an unpaid printer's bill, and a nearly complete manuscript that no publisher had yet agreed to take on. The books Clara had kept, the printer's bill she had managed by selling the better pieces of furniture. The manuscript she had continued quietly in the hours before the household stirred, and in the evenings after her duties were done, because she could not leave her father's final argument half-made, and because the argument, she believed, was worth completing. Her duties were those of a companion to Lady Dorothea Wyndham, which was, of all the positions available to a woman of Clara's education and circumstances, the one that required the most precise negotiation of dignity. Lady Dorothea was 71, sharp-minded, genuinely kind, and possessed of the particular quality that belongs to people who have outlived a great deal and found themselves unexpectedly at peace with the world as a result. She treated Clara with a respect that Clara had learned not to take for granted, and she asked of her nothing more degrading than occasional accompaniment to events at which Clara's presence was superfluous to everyone's purposes, except Lady Dorothea's own comfort. The house party at Thornmere Hall was one such event. Lady Dorothea had been invited by the Duke's great-aunt, with whom she had maintained a friendship spanning 6 decades, and she had accepted with the serene confidence of a woman who goes wherever she pleases and expects to be welcome. Clara had been brought along because Lady Dorothea disliked sleeping in unfamiliar houses without someone nearby who understood her preferences for morning tea. The gathering was, by the standards of the season, remarkable primarily for the nature of its central figure's resistance to its purpose. Edmund Ravenscroft, the 6th Duke of Thornmere, had declined every match presented to him over 4 consecutive seasons, with a patience that had become, in the drawing rooms of London, something between legend and scandal. He was 33 years old, possessed of a title, 3 estates, a fortune that any accountant would have described as embarrassingly healthy, and a face that painters occasionally wrote to him about without invitation, He was, by the arithmetic of the marriage market, the most desirable man in England. For he was also entirely uninterested in being desired. The gathering at Thornmere had been engineered with the collective determination of a family that had decided 4 seasons of polite refusal constituted a crisis. His great-aunt had assembled a careful selection of eligible young women of impeccable family and considerable accomplishment, alongside enough other guests to provide the illusion of a social occasion rather than an audition. The intention was self-evident to everyone present, including Edmund, who had agreed to host it with the resigned acceptance of a man who understands that the path of least resistance occasionally runs directly through his own drawing room. He had been, since the guest's arrival 2 days prior, scrupulously courteous and comprehensively unrevealing, which was a combination that satisfied the requirements of hospitality while providing his family with nothing useful. Lady Isadora Pembridge had arrived with the specific energy of a woman who had surveyed the field and judged it already won. She was the second daughter of the Marquis of Albourne, extraordinarily beautiful in the arrangement of her features, and possessed of an intelligence she deployed primarily in the service of social calculation. She had decided, with the precision of a woman who does not waste her ambitions on uncertain targets, that the Duke of Thornmere would be her husband before the close of the year. She had positioned herself accordingly from the moment of her arrival, occupying the conversational center of every gathering, managing the room's attention the way a conductor manages an orchestra, and treating anyone outside the radius of relevance with a pleasantness so efficiently calibrated, it left no room for genuine warmth. She had noticed Clara on the first evening with the particular attention that beautiful women sometimes direct at the invisible, a brief, comprehensive assessment that registered the companion's dress, the absence of family connection, the quality of quiet that Clara carried, and concluded, rapidly and without particular malice, that she required no further consideration. Clara had registered this assessment with equal efficiency, and had felt, as she always felt in such moments, a small, private, composed determination to occupy her own existence as fully as possible, regardless of what other people chose to see when they looked at her direction. It was in this spirit that she had slipped away from the evening's gathering at 8 o'clock, having ensured that Lady Dorothea was comfortably settled with her old friend, and had no need of her company until morning, and had found her way to the library. She had stood in the doorway for a moment the first time she had seen it that afternoon, during the house tour that preceded the evening's arrival, and she had felt something that she could only describe as recognition. The feeling of a person encountering a space that reflects their own interior architecture back to them with such accuracy that it produces a kind of vertigo. The ceiling, the depth of the shelves, the particular quality of accumulated silence that only books can produce. She had looked at it for 30 seconds and had known, with the certainty of long practice, that she would return. She had not expected the Duke to return also. Now he sat across from her in the chair nearest the fire, standing, she had gathered, having been somewhat dispossessed of it for the evening, and he was looking at her with an expression she could not entirely read. It was not the expression she had expected, which was the polite but fundamental blankness with which people of his world typically registered the existence of companions. It was something more awake than that, more specifically directed, and it made her acutely conscious of the pencil she had just returned to behind her ear, which was not a habit she had intended to display in the Duke's presence. "You are Lady Dorothea's companion," he said. It was not a question. I am. She is a remarkable woman. She is. Clara looked at him steadily, and she would be horrified to know I was monopolizing your library rather than ensuring her comfort. She retired an hour ago. I know because my housekeeper mentioned it, and because Lady Dorothea is entirely consistent in her habits, and the habits of guests who retire at 9 o'clock do not require supervision. A brief pause. You are not monopolizing the library. You are occupying one chair. I have not inconvenienced you. You have your library back. I had it before. You were here, and I had it still. He looked at the book she was still holding. My father acquired that volume in 1849. I don't believe anyone has argued with it before. I should hope that's not true. Something changed in his expression, not quite a smile. More the shadow that precedes one, the gathering of warmth before it fully commits to arrival. Why do you hope that? Because a book that has not been argued with is simply a record, she said. It becomes something more than a record only when someone brings their own thinking to it. Your father clearly had a great deal of thinking. It seems a waste if it has only been read and never answered. The shadow had not yet committed to becoming a smile, but it was closer. He extended his hand, and she gave him the book, and he looked at the margin where her pencil had been. She watched him read her annotation with the specific attentiveness of a person waiting for judgment they have decided they are not afraid of. He looked up. Your father was Gerald Ashbourne. The certainty of it caught her off guard. Yes. How did you... The handwriting. He turned the book so she could see it, and she saw, with a shock that rearranged something in her chest, that the margin next to her annotation was already occupied. Her father's hand, smaller than hers, more angular, written perhaps 20 years ago in a different pencil, but recognizably his. The same argument she had just made, arrived at from a different angle, offered to the same page. She said nothing for a long moment. The fire settled and shifted, sending a brief breath of warmth across the space between them. He corresponded with my father, Edmund said carefully, and his voice had changed quality. Not softer, exactly, but more deliberate, as though he was choosing his approach to something that required it. Some years before his death, they exchanged letters about this particular volume. I believe the margin annotations came after. Clara looked at the page, her father's words and hers, separated by decades and arriving independently at the same place. He never told me, she said. And then, because the truth came out of the same place it always came from when she forgot to manage it, he told me very little in the end. He was more interested in the arguments than in the people having them. He meant no unkindness by it. Some people are made that way, Edmund said. His tone carried something in it that she did not yet have enough information to identify, but that resonated with a frequency she recognized without being able to name. The ideas are more real to them than the ordinary machinery of daily life. It is not without its difficulties. She looked at him. You speak with some familiarity on the subject. I do, he said. A silence fell that was not. Clara noted with the careful honesty she applied to most things, uncomfortable. It was in the middle of this silence, not breaking it so much as arriving through it like a figure stepping out of fog, that the library door opened, and Lady Isadora Pembridge appeared on the threshold, holding a candlestick, and looked from the Duke to Clara and back to the Duke, with an expression that went through several rapid transitions and landed on something that wore the costume of pleasantness very precisely, but that Clara recognized, having been its subject before, as something rather different underneath. "Your Grace," Isadora said, "we had wondered where you had gone. I offered to come and find you." Her eyes moved to Clara with the brief, dismissing quality of someone acknowledging a piece of furniture. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything of consequence." Edmund set the book down on the side table. His expression had returned to the composed, pleasant neutrality that Clara suspected was his default register for most of his waking life, and which she had just, she understood, been briefly privileged to see the inside of. Miss Ashbourne was good enough to keep the library from going entirely unappreciated for the evening, he said, with a civility so precise it was impossible to fault, and yet somehow communicated, to Clara at least, rather more than civility. "I believe I was the one interrupting." "How charming," said Isadora, in the tone that certain women use for things they find anything but. She looked at Clara with a smile that was perfectly assembled and delivered with the confidence of a woman who knows she is being watched and has calibrated every element of her expression accordingly. "You must be Lady Dorothea's little companion. We were wondering what had become of you. It must be rather overwhelming, a gathering of this size, when one is not quite—" A brief, considered pause, the kind that arrives pre-loaded with its meaning. "Accustomed to this sort of company." Clara met her gaze. She had been meeting gazes of this particular variety for the better part of her adult life, and she had learned that the correct response was not the one that the gazes hoped for. She said, very quietly and with complete composure, "I find the library quite manageable." Edmund rose, and he looked at Isadora with the expression of a man who has heard what he needed to hear about a situation, and has filed the information in a place where it will remain accessible. "Shall we return to the drawing room? I believe I have neglected my guests long enough." He paused at the doorway, and Clara, who had risen also and was holding the book out to return it, found him looking at her with an expression that she could not entirely account for, too direct for courtesy, too composed for anything she had been led to expect. "Take it," he said. "Finish the argument." Then he was gone, and Lady Isadora's smile in the doorway carried something in it that Clara recognized as a warning issued, and she held the book in both hands and listened to the fire, and thought about a page with two margins filled by two different hands arriving at the same answer across 20 years, and felt, beneath all of her careful practicality, beneath all of the management and the composure and the determination to deal in facts rather than implications, something she had not planned for and could not yet name, begin very quietly to stir. The house had not yet fully committed to mourning when Clara returned to the library. The servants were moving through the downstairs corridors with the muffled efficiency of people trained to be invisible before the guests required them to be visible, and the light coming through the east-facing windows was the particular pale gray of an October dawn that has not yet decided whether it intends to become anything warmer. She carried the book under her arm, his book, to her father's margins, her own annotation in fresh pencil, and she had told herself firmly at least twice since waking that she was returning it because it was the correct thing to do, and that the fact of her having thought about its contents and about the conversation that had accompanied them, with rather more frequency than the preceding 8 hours strictly warranted, was entirely beside the point. She pushed open the library door. He was already there. He was standing at the far end of the room with his back to her, still in his evening coat from the night before, which told her that he had not slept, or had slept very little, and which was information she had not requested, and found herself registering with a precision she could not entirely attribute to indifference. There was a candle on the desk beside him. It nearly burned to its base, and he was reading, standing at the desk, not sitting, in the way of a person who had intended something brief and found themselves delayed by the content. He turned when he heard her. The expression on his face in the half-second, before it settled into composure, was the same one she had seen briefly the previous evening. That quality of arrested attention, of a person encountering something unexpected and responding to it honestly before the social machinery can intervene. It was there, and then it was managed, but she had seen it, and she tucked the information away in the place where she kept things that required careful consideration. "You came back," he said, "to return the book." She crossed the room and set it on the desk. "I finished the argument." He looked at the volume, then at her. And he's still wrong," she said, "but he fails more interestingly than I had initially given him credit for." She paused. "The last 3 chapters make a better case than the first. I think he discovered what he was actually arguing about somewhere in the middle, which is not uncommon, and the earlier chapters suffer for being written before he understood his own conclusion." Edmund picked up the book, opened it to the back pages where she had written, and read in silence for a moment that stretched rather longer than she had anticipated. She stood and waited with the composure she had developed for waiting, and listened to the house coming slowly to life around them, and did not look at his face while he read, because she had decided that looking at his face while he read her words was an exposure she had not earned. "You write like someone who has been having this argument for years," he said finally. "I grew up in it." She looked at the shelves rather than at him. "My father's dinner table was a seminar with worse food. Every meal was an argument about something. He would take the opposing position simply to test your reasoning. I spent most of my childhood being wrong out loud and learning from the experience." "That sounds," he paused, "instructive and exhausting in equal measure." "It was both." A brief silence. "I was angry about it for years. Toward the end, I understood it was his way of taking me seriously." She stopped herself, because she had not intended to say that, and because it was the kind of thing one said to people with whom one had established the right to say it, and she was not certain she had established that right. "So I apologize. I'm oversharing before the house has had its breakfast." "Don't apologize." His voice had the quiet firmness of a person who means what they say, without requiring emphasis for the meaning to land. He set the book down and looked at her in the morning light, which was kinder than last night's firelight had been, and said, as though the thought had been standing in line for some time and had only now reached the front of it. "I have been corresponding for nearly 2 years now with someone I have never met. A scholar. We have been arguing about exactly this question, the one your annotation addresses, the relationship between instinct and reason. Whether examined, thought requires the suppression of natural response, or is made possible by it." A pause that carried its own weight. "The correspondence has been—" He stopped. Clara looked at him. He was looking at the window, at the pale October light, with the expression of a person choosing their words with unusual care. "It has been the most useful intellectual exchange I have had in recent memory," he said. which is itself somewhat revealing about the quality of my other exchanges. She kept her expression composed and even, and felt beneath it a very specific sensation, the kind that arrives when something familiar is glimpsed in an unexpected place, when your mind presents you with a pattern you recognize before you have finished assembling the pieces. She pushed it aside and filed it for later consideration, in the methodical way her father had taught her to treat information that arrived before you were ready for it. "You are fortunate," she said carefully. "Good correspondence is a rare thing." "It is." He looked at her. "The difficulty is that the letters arrive addressed to me through the journal that published my original essay, which means I know very little about the person sending them, only that they sign with a single initial, and that they have read rather widely and argued rather well." The almost smile again. "I have tried to determine, from the internal evidence of the letters themselves, something of their circumstances. I have been largely unsuccessful." "What have you determined?" "That they read in the evenings," he said. "The letters are written in a hand that changes quality across the page, sharper at the top, looser below, which suggests fatigue, and suggests the writing happens at the end of the day rather than the beginning. That they have suffered a significant loss recently, which has altered the tone of the correspondence without diminishing its precision. And that they are," he stopped again, with the quality of someone who has reached the edge of what they intended to say and is reconsidering the boundary. "That they are someone whose thinking I find I have come to rely upon in a way that I did not anticipate when the first letter arrived." Clara stood in the morning light of Thornmere Library and kept her face entirely still, and thought about a letter she had written at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday evening in February, 8 months ago, in the small sitting room of Lady Dorothea's Mayfair townhouse, with the fire burned low, and her father's manuscript open on the desk beside her, and a feeling of such specific loneliness pressing against the window glass that she had needed to put it somewhere, and had put it, as she always put things she could not otherwise manage, into an argument. She had sent it the following morning, and had received a response 3 weeks later that had made her sit down very suddenly in the middle of reading it, and remain sitting for rather longer than she had intended. She thought about all of this and said, with a composure that cost her something she was not going to acknowledge, "I hope the correspondence continues to be useful." "As do I," he said. And then, because the morning was pressing its light more insistently through the windows, and the house was genuinely awake now, and the window for this kind of conversation was closing with the audible efficiency of a world that had not been consulted about whether it was convenient, he added, "Miss Ashbourne, if you should find yourself with time this afternoon, I believe the other guests are planning an excursion to the lake. If you are not required by Lady Dorothea, I thought I might show you the North Collection. It was my grandfather's, and it has never been properly catalogued. It is possible your father would have known some of the volumes." She looked at him. "I would like that very much," she said. And she meant it completely, for 2 entirely different reasons, and neither of which she was yet ready to examine at full length in the morning light of someone else's library. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The excursion to the lake took most of the other guests away from the house for the better part of 3 hours that afternoon, which meant that the north wing was quiet in the particular way that large houses are quiet when the performing members of a household are temporarily elsewhere. Lady Dorothea, who had expressed no interest whatsoever in the lake and considerable interest in a nap, had dismissed Clara cheerfully and without further inquiry, which was one of the many qualities Clara valued in her. So the North Collection occupied a smaller room adjacent to the main library, a room that smelled of dust and old leather and the specific dry sweetness of paper that has been resting undisturbed for decades. The shelves here were arranged with the idiosyncratic logic of someone who had organized by association rather than subject. Books grouped by some private system of relation that required knowledge of the collector's mind to decode. Edmund moved through it with the ease of someone who had grown up in the room, occasionally pulling a volume from the shelf with the confidence of a man who knows exactly where things are and has never bothered to explain the system to anyone because no one had previously seemed worth explaining it to. He was explaining it now. This was something Clara noted without commenting on, or in the same category as his manner of listening, which was the attentive, genuinely receptive kind that makes you aware, mid-sentence, that what you say is actually landing rather than simply being registered. He explained the logic of the North Collection, the associative chains, the private connections, the volumes that had belonged to his grandfather's particular obsessions, with an ease that suggested he had been carrying this knowledge in isolation for some time and found the act of sharing it unexpectedly uncomplicated. These were his working shelves, Edmund said, gesturing at the middle tier. The ones he consulted regularly. You can tell by the wear on the spines. The outer shelves are aspirational. He bought them because he intended to read them. I never quite managed. He pulled a volume from the middle tier and handed it to her. This one he read 4 times. I know because there are 4 different colors of annotation. Clara took the volume. She turned the pages with the careful hands of someone who had grown up understanding books as objects deserving of respect, and she felt, as she always felt when she encountered a heavily annotated volume, the specific intimacy of entering someone's private conversation with an author, argument and counter-argument, questions in the margins, passages underlined with varying degrees of urgency, the whole record of a mind working through something in real time. He wrote well, she said. In the margins, I mean. You can follow his thinking from one passage to the next. So he was changing his mind about something across the span of the reading. You can see it shift. He was. Edmund was standing beside her now, close enough to read the margin over her shoulder, which was a proximity neither of them had deliberately engineered, and neither of them moved to reduce. He began the book convinced of one position and ended it convinced of another. He never revised his opinion in conversation, too proud for it. But the books record all the conversions he would never have admitted to publicly. The books were safer, Clara said. People can't argue back. Some people can. He looked at her, and she felt the look rather than meeting it, because she was looking at the page. Some people argue back across 40 years and several scholarly generations. She turned a page and said nothing. The afternoon light in the North Collection was amber and still, and somewhere in the house, a clock was marking the half-hour with the measured patience of something that understood it had all the time available. She thought about what he had said that morning, about the correspondent who wrote at the end of the day with a hand that tired across the page, and she thought about everything she had put into those letters. the grief of her father's final months, the specific loneliness of being intelligent in circumstances that offered intelligence nowhere useful to go, the arguments about instinct and reason that had been her inheritance and were becoming, she had hoped, something more than inheritance. She thought about all of this and kept it very carefully contained, because there were things she needed to understand before she did anything with them. "I have been reading your essays," she said, because there was no safe way to approach this except directly, and because she had learned from her father that the direct approach, taken with sufficient composure, was frequently less exposing than the indirect one. He went still, not visibly, not the kind of stillness that announces itself, but the quality of the air between them changed in a way she had become, over the past 18 hours, sensitive enough to detect. "My essays," he said, "in the Quarterly, the series on moral intuition and examined thought, published under the name E.R. Blackwood." She kept her voice even. She did not look at him. "I came across the first one in my father's correspondence 2 years ago, and he had been writing to the journal about it. He found the argument, characteristically for my father, incomplete, but worth engaging with." She turned another page of the book in her hands, though she was no longer reading it. "He died before he could finish the engagement." The room was entirely quiet. Edmund did not move. "After he died," Clara continued, "I found the letter he had been drafting, a response to the third essay, which had arrived the week before the end. He had managed 2 pages. She did pause then, briefly, in the way one pauses when something catches momentarily on its way past. "I finished it. I sent it. And I received a reply, and I replied in turn, and I continued." She could feel him looking at her. She could not yet look back. "You are A," he said. It was not a question. His voice had changed quality in a way that she could hear, but had no adequate language for. Something stripped of its usual management. Something that had not prepared itself for the moment it was now inside. "My middle name is Anne." She finally turned the page she had been not reading and turned to face him, and found that his expression was entirely unguarded in the way she had glimpsed it before, the way she had seen it move briefly into openness before the composure could recover itself. But this time the composure was not recovering. This time what was on his face was something she recognized the shape of, because it was the same shape as what was in her own chest, and that particular rearrangement of the understanding that happens when the thing you have been carrying in private turns out to have had company all along without your knowledge. "You wrote," he stopped, started again. "In February. There was a letter in February about the question of what is owed to the dead when they leave their arguments unfinished, whether we complete their thoughts or our own understanding of their thoughts, and whether the distinction matters." "I remember writing it," she said quietly. "I was uncertain whether to send it. It was," she paused, "more personal than the others." "I read it 4 times, he said. "I have read most of your letters multiple times. I have been." He stopped again, and she understood that this was a man reaching the edge of what he was accustomed to saying, reaching it and finding himself unwilling, for the first time in a long while, to stop at the edge. "I have been trying to understand, from the letters alone, what kind of person was writing them. I had formed a picture, incomplete and possibly inaccurate. And you have been here for 2 days. "I've been here for 2 days, Clara agreed. "In my library," he said. writing in my margins. With your grandfather's pencil. She held it up. She had found it on the desk that morning and used it without thinking, and he looked at it now with an expression that contained too many things at once to read clearly. I didn't realize it was his until just now. I'm sorry. Don't be. He said it with a certainty that left no room for argument, and then he turned to the shelf and stood looking at it for a moment with his back to her, in the way of a person processing something that requires a moment of privacy, even in company. It was precisely then that the door of the North Collection opened. Lady Isadora Pembridge stood on the threshold in a walking dress of deep rose, slightly flushed from the air outside, holding her gloves in one hand with the practiced casualness of a woman who had learned to make an entrance look like an accident. She took in the room, the amber light, the proximity, the book still in Clara's hands, the quality of the silence she had interrupted, with the swift, comprehensive intelligence of a person who misses very little. And her expression did what it always did in the presence of Clara, assembled itself into pleasant condescension with the efficiency of something that had been practiced into instinct. "Your Grace," she said, addressing Edmund, with a warmth that left no ambiguity about its direction. "We have just returned from the lake. Your aunt was asking for you." Her eyes moved to Clara, with the deliberate economy of someone making the secondary acknowledgement as brief as possible. "And I see you have found company." She let the word settle, because she was a woman who understood the precise weight of certain words in certain contexts, and then she smiled with all the warmth of someone who has decided to be generous to something harmless. "How charming that Lady Dorothea's companion has kept you entertained. I hope she has not taken up too much of your time, Your Grace. I know how patient you are with guests of all varieties." She paused on the final phrase with the specific timing of a woman who knows exactly how far a pause can carry meaning, and then turned the warmth of her smile up another degree and said, with the pleasantness of someone delivering a verdict wrapped in courtesy, "We have been quite worried about you below, miss. Forgive me. I don't believe I have your name." Clara had the name. Clara had had the name for 3 days and had declined to offer it on both previous occasions that Isadora had made a point of not using it, because there are some performances it is more dignified not to participate in, and she had made her peace with being unnamed in rooms where the naming served primarily as a reminder of her position. She said her name now, clearly, without elaboration, meeting Isadora's gaze with the composure she had been refining since childhood. Isadora received it with a smile. "How lovely. Well, Miss Ashbourne, I expect Lady Dorothea will be wondering where you've got to. She did seem rather set in her habits." She tilted her head with the expression of someone offering assistance. "I shouldn't like to think of her waiting." Edmund moved. Not dramatically. He was not a man who moved dramatically, but with the quiet decisiveness of someone who has heard what he needed to and made a calculation. He set the volume he was holding back on the shelf with care and turned with the full composed authority of a man entirely comfortable in his own space. "Lady Dorothea is resting," he said pleasantly. "I believe we established that this morning. Miss Ashbourne has been good enough to assist me with the North Collection, which has needed attention for some time. I am grateful for her help." He looked at Isadora with the pleasant, unreadable expression of a man maintaining perfect civility at some remove from its usual warmth. Please tell my aunt I will join the party for tea in half an hour." Isadora held his gaze for a moment, with the expression of a woman recalculating, reassessing the distance between where she had assumed she stood and where she was discovering she actually stood. And then she smiled, broadly, without warmth, and excused herself with the flawless manners of someone who has been well trained to lose gracefully in public. The door closed behind her. Clara turned the pencil over in her fingers. The room had returned to its amber stillness, but the quality of the stillness had changed. "She will not let it rest," she said. "Why, you understand that." It was not a warning. She did not have the standing to offer warnings, but simply an honest statement of what she had observed about the way certain people operate when they have decided something is owed to them. "I know." He looked at her, and the unguarded quality was still there, had not retreated entirely since the revelation, was holding its ground with the slightly precarious quality of something that has been let out for the first time in a while, and is not entirely certain of its welcome. "Miss Ashbourne." "Clara." He said her name the second time, as though testing whether it was permitted, and she did not give him any indication that it was not. "I have 18 months of letters and 2 days of a house party, and I am aware that is not a sufficient basis for—" He stopped and started again. With the care of a man who has spent his professional life being precise and is finding that precision, in this particular arena, is both necessary and insufficient. "I would like to continue this conversation after the house party ends, if you are willing." She looked at him steadily. The afternoon light was soft, and the North Collection was quiet, and she was holding a pencil that belonged to a man who had died 40 years ago, and had left his arguments in these margins for someone to find. And she thought about all the letters she had written at the end of tired days, when she had nowhere useful to put her mind, and about the voice in the replies, precise, honest, occasionally infuriating, always worth reading, and about the fact that this voice had been in this house for 33 years, and had been across a library from her last night, had been beside her for the last 2 hours, and had been, in some form, the person she had been talking to for almost 2 years, without either of them knowing it. "I am willing," she said. She left the North Collection before him, because the situation required it, and because Isadora Pembridge was still somewhere in the house with her recalculations and her social intelligence and her long patience. And Clara had been in the world long enough to understand that the appearance of things frequently determined their outcome, and that there were battles worth choosing and distances worth maintaining, at least for now, at least while the ground was still settling. But she kept the grandfather's pencil. She turned it over in her fingers as she walked back through the house toward Lady Dorothea's rooms, and she thought about what had been true for 18 months without anyone knowing it, and about what had been discovered in 2 days in a library in October, and about the specific, strange grace of a story that had been happening before either of its participants understood they were in it. What she didn't know, what she couldn't yet have known, because Isadora Pembridge hadn't yet shown the full range of what she was capable of, and because the house party had 3 days remaining, and because certain people, when they understand that they are losing, are willing to commit to measures that comfortable winning would never have required, was that the hardest part was not yet upon her. It was coming. It was being assembled, even then, show in the rose-papered bedroom at the end of the guest corridor, by a woman who had decided that if she could not have what she wanted, she could at least ensure that the person who stood between her and it understood the cost of the position. Clara walked through the house with the pencil in her hand and her composure around her like armor, and did not yet know how much she was going to need it. It happened on the final morning of the house party, which was either very good timing or very bad timing, depending on which side of it you occupied, and which Clara would later reflect had the particular quality of inevitability that belongs to things which have been building beneath the surface for long enough that their emergence, when it finally comes, is both a shock and a relief. She was summoned to the east drawing room at 10 o'clock. The summons arrived via a housemaid and was worded with the careful neutrality of a note that has been composed by someone who does not wish to reveal, in the wording, the nature of what awaits. Clara recognized the neutrality for what it was and went with the composure she always carried into uncertain rooms, which was the composure of someone who has learned that the uncertain room is frequently less dangerous than the anticipation of it. Edmund's great-aunt, Lady Constance Ravenscroft, was 74 years old and had the posture of a woman who had never once in her life permitted herself the indulgence of a slumped shoulder. She sat in the room's best chair with the settled authority of someone entirely at home in the delivery of judgment, and beside her on the settee, the in deep rose again, Isadora Pembridge favored colors that announced themselves, sat the woman who had clearly arranged this meeting, wearing the expression of someone who has done something she considers a necessary unpleasantness and is prepared to be thanked for it. Two other guests stood near the window, the social witnesses that these proceedings apparently required. "Miss Ashbourne?" Lady Constance's voice was not unkind, but it was thorough. "Lady Isadora has brought to my attention a matter that I believe requires clarity. She informs me that you have been conducting a private correspondence with my great-nephew for the better part of 2 years, under a false name, without his knowledge of your identity or your circumstances." She folded her hands in her lap. You will understand why I feel this requires an explanation." Clara looked at Isadora, who received the look with the expression of a woman who has delivered the blow she intended and is content to wait for the landing. Then she looked at Lady Constance and said, clearly and without hurry, "I will explain it entirely. May I ask how Lady Isadora came to know the details of a private correspondence?" A brief silence. Isadora's composure adjusted itself by a fraction that only Clara was watching closely enough to catch. "That is not," Lady Constance began. "I think it is relevant," Clara said, with the measured firmness of a person who has decided the direct approach is the only one worth taking. "Because the correspondence in question was conducted through an academic journal, addressed to a contributor who published under a pseudonym, in response to published essays on moral philosophy. My father initiated it. I continued it after his death. At no point did I know the identity of the correspondent. At no point was the correspondence anything other than an exchange of arguments about philosophy." She paused. "The question of how Lady Isadora obtained knowledge of its contents seems, under those circumstances, worth asking." Lady Constance turned to look at Isadora. It was a small movement, but it carried the quality of a tide-changing direction. Isadora's expression remained composed. She was a woman of considerable intelligence, and she hadn't, Clara observed, actually claimed to have read the letters. She had simply reported their existence and allowed Lady Constance to construct the most unfavorable interpretation. It was elegant, as these things went. It was also, what Clara thought, the kind of maneuver that unraveled badly when examined clearly in plain light. "The letters exist," Isadora said. "I saw a reference to them. I was concerned that a woman of Miss Ashbourne's position, in proximity to the Duke, might represent a complication." "A complication," Clara repeated. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "You mean that I represent an obstacle? I think that is the more accurate word." The door opened. Edmund Ravenscroft walked into the east drawing room with the unhurried certainty of a man who has been informed of a situation and has made his assessment of it before entering the room. He looked at his great-aunt, at Isadora, at the two witnesses by the window, and finally at Clara. And what was in his face when he looked at her was not the managed pleasantness he gave the room in general, but something more direct, more specific, the look of a person who has chosen which side of a line they are standing on. "I believe I should be part of this conversation," he said. Lady Constance regarded him with the expression of a woman who has known him since birth, and is therefore not surprised by anything he does, even when she would prefer to be. "Your presence may simplify matters. Then let me simplify them." He stood at the center of the room with the composed authority of a man who has spent his entire life having rooms arrange themselves around him, and spoke without theatrical emphasis, because he had never needed theater to be heard. "So Miss Ashbourne has been corresponding with me, with the pen name under which I publish, for 18 months. The correspondence was initiated by her father, Professor Gerald Ashbourne, whose work I have admired for a considerable time. When he died, Miss Ashbourne continued it. I was not aware of her identity until yesterday, and she was not aware of mine." He looked at Isadora briefly. There was no deception. There was, in fact, a coincidence of considerable rarity, which I find I am disinclined to treat as a liability. He returned his gaze to his great-aunt. "If there are questions about the propriety of the correspondence, I am happy to address them. I will simply note that the letters were entirely intellectual in their content, and that the intelligence that produced them is the same intelligence I have been watching operate in this house for 3 days, which has been the most genuinely interesting 3 days this house party has offered," Isadora said with a control that Clara could see required effort. "Your Grace, surely you must see that a companion with no family, and no—" "I see a scholar," Edmund said. His voice was entirely pleasant and entirely final, the voice of a man closing a door. "I see the daughter of a man I respected, who finished her father's arguments when he could not, and continued to make her own. I see someone who came to my library without agenda and argued with my books, and had the generosity to be right about them." He paused. "I am not certain what you see, Lady Isadora, but I find, on reflection, that your vision has not been a reliable guide to things worth attending to." The room was very quiet. Outside, the October park offered the neutral commentary of wind in the old trees. Lady Constance looked at her great-nephew for a long moment, with the expression of a woman reassessing a situation she thought she understood. Then she looked at Clara, with the thorough attention of someone seeing her, perhaps for the first time, as the full fact of what she actually was rather than the diminished category she had been placed in. She said, with the careful deliberateness of a woman who chooses her words with the awareness that they will not be forgotten, "Professor Ashbourne's daughter. I knew his work. Your father was a considerable man." "He was," Clara said. "Thank you." Isadora excused herself shortly afterward. She did it impeccably. The manners were irreproachable to the last, and the door closed behind her with a quietness that said everything the silence needed said. The two witnesses drifted with the collective discretion of people who understand they have seen enough to report and are deciding how much of what they report to embellish. Lady Constance rose, which required a moment, and looked at the two of them with the expression of a woman who has lived long enough to recognize when the world is sorting itself correctly. "I'm going to take my tea," she said, "and I'm going to take it alone, because I have earned the peace of it." She moved toward the door and paused, with her hand on the frame, and looked back at Edmund. "Your father," she said quietly, "refused to change his position about anything in his entire life. So you have always been better than your father." She left. The east drawing room settled into its own silence. Through the window, the park was gold and gray and entirely indifferent to what happened in houses, which was itself a kind of comfort. Edmund looked at Clara. She looked at him. Between them, undramatically, with the quality of things that have been true for long enough to be entirely certain of themselves. Something simply completed. "The house party ends tomorrow," he said. "It does. I would like to call on Lady Dorothea, and on you." He said it with the directness that was, she understood now, simply the way he was, the way the letters had been, every honest sentence of them, all the way back to the beginning. Not as a social obligation, not as a continuation of an arrangement, for as a man who finds that the most interesting person he has encountered in years has spent 18 months living in his correspondence, and he would rather she lived somewhere considerably closer. Clara looked at him for a long moment. She thought about her father's margins and her own, sitting beside each other on the same page. She thought about letters written at the end of tired days, sent into the apparent dark, and answered, always answered, by a voice she had valued without knowing whose it was. She thought about what endures, which was the argument they had been having all along, in one form or another. And she thought that perhaps this was what endurance looked like from the inside, not permanence for its own sake, but truth finding its way to the surface, patient and inevitable, through whatever distance it had to cross. "Yes," she said, simply, completely, with the certainty of someone who has finished the argument and found the conclusion sound. And in a library in Wiltshire, in the margins of a book that had been holding 2 separate hands' worth of thinking for 20 years, waiting for someone to notice that they had always been pointing at the same thing. Nothing changed, because nothing needed to. It had always been there. The truth usually is. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.